Why can some people squat deeper than other people? We'll try to answer this question, but the squat movement itself, the first thing you should know is that the squat movement itself is incredibly complicated, just in the sense that there are a lot of moving parts, there are a lot of muscles involved, there are a lot of joints involved. Our ankles, our knees, our hips, our pelvis, lumbar spine, thoracic spine, even our shoulders, depending on how we're holding a bar or a kettlebell or a dumbbell. So the first thing I'll mention is coordination, and this is really reflective of how complicated the squat movement is. When we go through a complicated movement like a squat, one of the things to remember is that there are a lot of different muscles that are lengthening and shortening at the same time. And so coordination is really just improved by practicing the movement correctly, and you will improve your ability to coordinate those movements. But again, you have to practice it correctly over time. You'll get better at coordinating the squat movement. Now, the second thing might be mobility. You might have actual mobility concerns aside from just the coordination itself. If you do, you would find that through some passive stretching or passive testing of mobility. If you had problems where maybe your femur wasn't moving quite correctly in your hip capsule and there was a little range of motion to be gained there, that could be an instance where mobility could be an actual problem. The next thing is what we call anthropometry. Anthropometry in this sense, for a squat, is mostly going to be about the length of your femur. So the thing about squatting is that when you get down into maybe the middle of a squat and your femur starts to get horizontal, it does two things. First, it pushes your knee forward, but then it also pushes your hip backward. The problem with this is that if you have a really, really long femur and you push your knee forward, what will happen is you'll run out of ankle dorsiflexion at some point. Either that or your heel will come off the ground. But if you keep your heel on the ground, your femur will then continue to push your hip backward because your femur is just long. When we do this, we can't keep our torso centered over our hip because it's too far back and it'll throw off our center of mass. So you have to compensatorily lean forward, which means you run out of hip flexion, perhaps before you have your butt all the way down as low as you think it should go. Now, the next thing is spine position. And this is kind of similar to the femur length. When it comes to spine position, a lot of people when they squat, they'll arch their lower back really, really hard. And while this can feel like a really strong position, a neutral spine will allow you to keep your pelvis in a more neutral position. See, when we arch our back really hard, it takes our pelvis with us and puts us into a position of relative flexion. And all that means is that you'll run out of hip range of motion, again, before you think you should. And this is a lot of times where butt wink comes from, because as we're trying to force that lumbar extension down into a squat, we get to the bottom and there's nowhere for our hips to go. And the natural progression next is to see your sacrum sort of tuck under to get into that really deep squat position. Now, the next couple things are mostly genetic. Along with femur length, there are also things like the way our pelvis is shaped and structured that could theoretically be affecting our squat. It's not really something you'll know, and it's not something you'll be able to test for, but there is some genetic difference between people, between individuals. So along with femur length, you might also find that there are some variables like pelvic shape that you really can't do much about. So in order to squat deepest for yourself, what do we need to do? Well, the first thing is we need to make sure we're working on our mobility. If you feel like you are lacking hip flexion range of motion, ankle dorsiflexion, thoracic spine extension, these are all opportunities for us to improve our mobility and then work on our squat with that improved mobility. If we have good mobility, likely what the issue might be is our either spine position or our coordination through the movement. And the best way to fix these two things is to practice squatting with a neutral spine. This might mean choosing different squat variations. This might mean getting more practice with lighter weights. But practicing the coordination of a nice squat and doing it with a neutral spine, practicing the movement correctly, is probably the best way to improve your squat depth. And the last thing to remember is that Not everybody is built to squat with their butt all the way to the floor. Not with a neutral spine, at least. Everybody in the world could probably get to something that looks like a very deep squat, but for a lot of people, it wouldn't be a very strong position to lift weights in. The best folks to squat are generally those that have really short femurs and a longer torso, and probably a favorable pelvic shape that's conducive to the act of squatting. So not everybody in the world is meant to take their neutral spine down with their butt all the way to their heels. That is reserved for those that are just kind of built for it. So that is all you probably need to know about deep squatting in a nutshell. The best thing to do is to work on keeping a neutral spine, maybe place something under you like we do at the gym. We always have boxes underneath everybody when they squat, and what we do is we change which side the box is on to accommodate where their best depth is, so they can get the best range of motion, maintain a neutral spine while they do it, and just get the most out of the exercise. So that's something you could also do too, is keep something underneath you. That way you know to keep your depth consistent, and over time you may find that if you fix a couple of these things, like I said, maybe mobility or just with practice, you might find that your squat depth improves.